In the previous episode, I gave the viewers a choice of what carburetor to test next on our 670cc Predator-powered 1969 Renault. The choice was either the dual 24mm carburetors or a single 36mm carburetor, and the viewers overwhelmingly chose the 36mm carburetor. So in this episode, we're going to replace our current 32mm carburetor with a slightly larger 36mm carburetor and see if we can further improve the performance of the two-cylinder Predator engine. So this 32mm carburetor that we have been using has delivered pretty good performance so far, but can this 36mm carburetor further improve performance? Let's find out. Now this carburetor, as well as the 32mm carburetor, are knockoff versions of the Kian CVK carburetors. I believe this carburetor is a low-cost replacement for the single-cylinder Honda TRX 500. Now, off camera, I've already had this carburetor running on the Predator engine, and according to the wideband air fuel gauge, we're going to need to change both the pilot jet and the main jet, and we'll also need to add a few shims to the needle valve on the Venturi. Let's start with taking the float chamber off and having a peek inside this carburetor. Well, at first glance, everything looks the same as the smaller carburetor, so no surprises there, and that's good. Let's take a closer look so everybody is on the same page. I'll spare you guys the lecture and cut right to the chase. After a few days of testing off camera, this is what we came up with. Now keep in mind, this is an old school carburetor and not a modern EFI system, so there are no cells you can click on to adjust the air fuel mixture. Nope, I'm afraid if you want to tune a carburetor, you're gonna have to get your hands dirty. This particular carburetor doesn't have an adjustable needle valve on the Venturi slide, but that wasn't a problem. You see, the common workaround for this issue is just to install shims under the needle if you need to raise it. And in our case, we had to add 2.6mm of shims. Now, that seems like a lot, but that's what worked best. So none of these modifications were just random. In fact, the way we got the air-fuel ratio where we wanted it from idle to wide-open throttle was to use a wideband sensor on the exhaust. Now, the wideband is handy, but it's actually worthless if you don't take notes. Anyway, it's kind of like cheating. Now, most people tune motorcycle carburetors by ear and throttle response, which I believe is very subjective. At least with the wideband, you can actually see the numbers. Now, according to my notes, I feel like this carburetor is pretty close to being how I want it, and I think it's time to do an actual performance test on video. Now, getting the 36mm carburetor to fit this aftermarket Performance 670 intake manifold required changing the rubber carburetor flange to a slightly larger one. Actually, the flange that we're using is for a Honda TRX 500, and it has the same bolt spacing as the smaller flange. Oh, before I forget, the 3D printed manifold spacer that we tested in the previous video is still on the engine, and since it helped with the smaller carburetor, it makes sense to continue using it. Okay, well, I think we have enough stuff jammed in place and we can start the engine. Now, we do have an air filter, don't worry about that, and there's also a bunch of other stuff that needs to be installed. But first I want to start the engine to make sure there's no leaks or other problems. Then I'll assemble the rest of the stuff and we can take the car for a road test. So far, so good, no leaks. I say we start the engine and see what happens. So what's nice about having the engine in the back of the car is I can watch the wideband gauge on the dashboard as I make adjustments to the carburetor. I guess it would help if I also clean the back window, but that's a project for another day. You know, with this car, we don't need to see what's behind us, just what's ahead, or something like that. So here's the notebook I was talking about earlier. It certainly comes in handy to keep track of all the stuff we did over the past 2 days. Anyway, let me put the rest of the car back together and we'll hit the road. You know, this is probably the 4th or 5th road test I've made with this 36mm carburetor, and at this point, everything's looking pretty good. The engine seems to run fine and the air-fuel mixture is pretty close to what I was after. However, I just can't detect any difference in driving performance with the bigger carburetor, and I guess that's both good and bad. I reckon the only way to tell if this larger carburetor makes a difference is to do an acceleration test. In the past, our acceleration tests were from 0 to 55 miles per hour, but from this point forward, we're only going to take the car up to 50 miles per hour, and the reason is, by the time we hit 50 miles per hour, we're past the red line of the engine, and no matter what we do, this more or less stock engine doesn't seem to make power above 4,000 RPM. Anyway, once we hit 50, I'll shift the transmission into 4th gear and continue the acceleration test up to 55 miles per hour. As usual, we're going to start off in 3rd gear and let the CVT drive do all the hard work getting this car up to speed. Believe it or not, using 3rd gear is the fastest way to accelerate this car, and that's because we also have a CVT transmission as well as the 4-speed manual transmission. This gauge is for the air-fuel mixture, and that's for those who are interested. The time to beat is 22.97 seconds for the 0 to 50 and 29.77 seconds for the 0 to 55. Alright, it looks like we shaved a little bit more than a second from the 0 to 50, and that's awesome. Now, for the 0 to 55, we were a fraction of a second slower, and obviously that's because I had to shift the transmission. Now, I got a lot of criticism in the previous video about how slow I shift, and yeah, the slow shifting does affect the time, but a lot of folks were not aware that this car doesn't have a conventional clutch, and when I shift the transmission, I'm not using a clutch. So it's a bit tricky, and sometimes it takes longer to shift. That's exactly why we don't normally shift during the acceleration runs. Now, that explanation is good enough for most people, but also keep in mind this is a 54-year-old car with questionable synchronizers in the transmission, and the shift linkage is about as stiff as a wet noodle, so it's just not possible to shift this transmission quickly. You know, I think I do a pretty good job shifting this hot mess without a clutch, and trust me, I've had plenty of practice on this car, as well as all the other manual transmission cars I've owned in the past. Okay, now it's time for some drama. As the story goes, we were heading out to do a fuel economy test, and the car started making a funny noise. Actually, it's more of a funny strange than a funny haha noise. And now we're back at the shop. So as you can see, we have the Renault raised up on jack stands, which is generally never good, especially since we're working on the carburetor and not the drive system. Anyway, the funny noise turned out to be the brand new drive belt was starting to disintegrate. Now this belt was checked literally a few minutes before, and it was in perfect condition. You see, we've gotten into the habit of checking the CVT drive belt every time the car is road tested, and for good reason. A few episodes ago, the belt completely failed and left me stranded on the side of the road, which turned out to be a pleasant experience, all things considered. So this new belt, which has about 50 to 60 miles on it, and I'd say about a dozen or so hard launches, maybe a little more, it's hard to remember. Anyway, even though we are exceeding the maximum rating of this belt, we feel it should last a bit longer. And to be fair, it's only slightly damaged at this point. So the type of failure I would normally expect would be the rapid wearing of the rubber portion of the belt and not the fraying of the cords. We've been using this type of CVT drive for a while now, and normally we see an accumulation of, black powdered dust around the drive system as the belt wears. And currently we're not seeing the telltale signs of normal belt wear. So this fraying of the cords is somewhat alarming, even though we're fully aware that the belt's not rated for the power we're transmitting through it. Anyway, I reckon before we completely destroy the CVT drive belt by driving the car, we should try and figure out what's causing the belt to prematurely fail. Probably the best thing to do is to run the engine and watch what the belt's doing. Perhaps it's something obvious. The belt appears to more or less be working as expected, and the drive pulley seems a little bit slow on retracting, and it may be binding due to a lubrication issue. You know, these clutches use a dry graphite lubricant on the bushings, and it may be time to service the pulley, but I don't really think that's the problem. Anyway, it's pretty cool to see how the CVT drive system works. Now, if you're not familiar with how all this stuff works, then, well, this is a good example of how the CVT goes through its infinite amount of ratios. It's like having a 1 billion speed manual transmission that continuously is shifting through all its gears. When we do our acceleration run, well, we're starting off in third gear, but the CVT is actually starting with a ratio equivalent to first gear, and by the time we hit 30 miles per hour, the CVT is shifted through an infinite amount of ratios and winds up at a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, from down here, we can see the drive belt's actually riding a little high in the pulley, and that ain't good. Anyway, this pulley seems okay. Let me pull the belt off and then we can take a better look on the bench. So this almost brand new belt is showing signs of damage to the cords. Now I don't think this belt has Kevlar cords, but Kevlar versions are available. The belts we're using on this project are supposed to be genuine Comet belts, and for the Comet 44 Magnum series clutches, the belts are symmetrical. Now I wonder why they have this arrow here on a symmetrical belt. Now the Comet 20 and the 30 series clutches, well, they use an asymmetrical belt. However, this part number indicates this is a symmetrical belt and it's made for the 40 series torque converter type clutches that we're using. Anyway, anyone know why they have an arrow on a symmetrical belt? Makes no sense. And like I said, I'm aware that the 20 and the 30 series belts are installed a specific way, but on the 40 series belts, Comet indicates the belt is symmetrical and there's no special way to install it. It's tough to say what's going on here, and I reckon I'm going to install this new belt and see how the new belt rides in the pulleys. Ah, so there it is. This could be our problem. You see right here, the brand new drive belt is riding high in the clutch. Now that ain't good. Actually, it looks like the belt's riding high enough that the cords are actually taking a beating. That's interesting. You see, when this engine cradle was built, we were very careful to set the distance between the crankshaft of the engine and the driven shaft on the transmission. There's a specific and critical distance you have to maintain between the shafts, and when we built this cradle, we also built a tool that we used in order to keep the shafts at the correct distance, and this tool is specifically made for the belt we're using. I don't recall this being an issue when we first put the car together, but apparently it's an issue now. The good news is, this is an easy fix, and all we really need to do is raise the engine about a 1/4 inch off the mounting platform. By moving the engine up, we should be able to get the belt to ride in the correct location on the pulleys. Alright, well, I realize the belt is not rated for the power that we're transmitting through it, but before we completely condemn the drive system, we need to correct the current issue and see if that helps prolong the belt life. Now, I'm sure by now there are a few people who have left comments about just replacing the entire CVT clutch system with something more robust. And to be fair, that's not a bad suggestion. However, this entire engine cradle and motor mount system was designed to work around the Comet 44 Magnum series clutch and 7-inch driven pulley. The next size up CVT system that's available is the Comet 94C Duster clutch system, and using that clutch would require completely re-engineering the entire engine cradle from the ground up. Now, I've received comments in the past from folks suggesting that we use a clutch from an ATV or even a snowmobile, and that seems like a decent idea. However, parts like those are generally made for engines with tapered crankshafts, and that won't work on this engine. So I want to make one more point, and it's something a lot of people tend to forget. These small engine experiments that we do are always just temporary modifications, and what I mean by that is, we never intended to convert this car into a Predator-powered monstrosity for the rest of its days. Nope, we build, test, and build some more. This Predator engine is not the only engine we planned on using in this car, and we plan on trying different engines in the future. Now, if this car was to be permanently powered by this 2-cylinder engine, then we would certainly take it it to the next level and upgrade the clutch. And of course, if you were building a Predator-powered car, then definitely don't use the Comet 44 series Magnum clutch on a 670cc engine. Use whatever clutch you want, and it looks like the Comet 94C would be an acceptable off-the-shelf solution. I think for now we're going to correct the distance issue and continue using the 44 Magnum clutch and see if the trouble we're having is actually due to the incorrect spacing. Raising the engine a quarter inch is not a big deal. We can knock that out in about a day or so. Now, instead of fixing the issue and just moving on, I wanted to document this and show you folks a possible reason why we're having belt problems. It may be once we correct the issue, the belts will last a lot longer and we won't have to go through the time and expense of building a completely new engine cradle. Heck, at this point, if we had to build a new cradle, I would ditch the 670 and try a different engine altogether. Anyway, in this video we had planned on testing a different intake manifold that one of our viewers designed. And I guess we could toss it on the engine and test it, but no. Before we do that, I want to fix the drive belt and retest the new carburetor without the custom manifold. The fact that we have to move the engine up a quarter inch also means the CVT drive ratios will also change. I think in the current state with the drive belt riding high in the clutch, well, we're getting a slight overdrive on the top end, and that could affect our 0 to 50 performance times either in a good way or a bad way. It's hard to tell, and the only way to be sure is to test again with the drive system correctly configured. Meh, I didn't say meh once in this video. Welp, I just said meh twice, so that's 3 times now. Let me know if you like the meh free videos, or should I start saying meh more often? Apparently it bothers some people. Meh. Anyway, I had fun today and I hope you did as well. Until next time. Meh.